Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Cris Martin, and I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies here at Harvard University. We're so glad that you've joined us for tonight's session of our year-long series, Russia in Search of a New Paradigm, Conversations with Yevgenia Albats. Today, we have the privilege of hosting both Dr. Fiona Hill and Lucian Kim for the conversation Unfair Triangle, Ukraine-U.S.-Russia. I invite you, our audience, to participate actively in today's discussion, which is being video recorded and will be posted on the Davis Center's YouTube channel. And now I'll introduce our speakers, but please note I have made their biographies brief because if I read them in full, we wouldn't have any time to have a conversation. So, Dr. Yevgenia Albats is a Russian investigative journalist, political scientist, author, and radio host. She received her PhD in political science from Harvard University and has since then split her time between academia and journalism. She taught political science at Moscow's Higher School of Economics, where she was the first professor to be fired for her political views. She has been editor-in-chief of the political weekly, The New Times, since 2007, as well as the host of Absolute Albats, which formerly ran on Echo Moskvy and is now available on her YouTube channel. Since being forced out of Russia in 2022, Dr. Albats has taught at NYU, served as a Media and Democracy Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and is now a visiting fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. She is the author of 4 independently researched books, including The State Within a State, The KGB and Its Hold on Russia, Past, Present, and Future. Dr. Fiona Hill is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Center on the United States and Europe. She also serves on the Harvard University Board of Overseers and is the chancellor at Durham University in the United Kingdom. Dr. Hill served as deputy assistant to the U.S. President and senior director for European and Russian affairs on the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019, as well as a national intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia at the U.S. National Intelligence Council from 2006 to 2009. She is the author of the best-selling memoir, There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century, and the co-author of Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, and The Siberian Curse, How Communist Planners Left Russia Out in the Cold, both published with Clifford Gaddy. Professor Hill is also a Davis Center alumna. She holds her master's degree in Soviet Studies from the Davis Center and also has her doctorate from Harvard in History, where she was a Frank Knox Fellow. She also holds a master's degree in Russian and modern history from St. Andrews, but we prefer to talk about the Davis Center first. Yes. And she studied at Moscow's Maurice Thorez Institute for Foreign Languages as well. Lucian Kim is a senior analyst for Ukraine and the International Crisis Group. He has reported on Ukraine and Russia since Vladimir Putin's first term in office. Based in Moscow and Berlin for more than 20 years, he covered Central and Eastern Europe as a correspondent for National Public Radio, Bloomberg News, and the Christian Science Monitor. He is the recipient of the Wilson Center Fellowship in Washington, D.C. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Albats.
Thank you very much, Cris. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much to all of you for coming. And of course, thank you very much to Dr. Fiona Hill and to Lucian Kim for coming to this event. I headlined this event as Unfair Triangle. It is an allusion to the famous Russian painting, Неравный брак, the unequal marriage. A young, beautiful woman from a low-income family is forced to marry an old, bald, and ugly man 3, if not 4 times her age. No comparisons. Just my emotions about what is going on concerning negotiations between the US and Russia and the US and Ukraine. And you can guess who is a young woman in this triangle. We are going to discuss all these questions today, you know, these negotiations, outcomes of what to expect, how it's going to go. A lot of news, you know, there were in the last month regarding all these questions. So with Fiona Hill and with Lucian Kim. By the way, with Fiona, we were grad students at one at the same time. Mm-hmm. Here at Harvard, she was a student of Richard Pipes historian of Russian history, and I was a student of Timothy Colton, of course, who was back then the faculty director of the Davis, it was Russian Research Center, which was, of course, established 76 years ago. Okay, so Lucian Kim is also the author of the recently published book, Putin's Revenge, Why Did Russia Invade Ukraine? I am very interested in your answer to these questions.
Gotta buy the book.
I know Lucian from Moscow when he covered Russia and Ukraine, and I'm eager, of course, to hear his thoughts about these questions. But first, we're going to show you a short interview with Aleksandr Dugin. He's a right-wing Russian philosopher and adherent of another Russian fascist, Ivan Ilyin. Dugin, whom American media named Putin's brains, and who is not by any means, and who had never been an advisor to Putin. It's all myth that for some reasons, kept repeated in the foreign media. But, he's a dear patron of the KGB people. And after a Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he got a chair at the Moscow State University. Now, he's a professor. He teaches students. Of course, who else? Of course, you need a fascist to teach students. So I would, we will see this. That's interview of Aleksandr Dugin to the CNN's Farid Zakaria. So, and then I would ask both of you to comment on it. Thank you.
You write in your most recent book that Putinism has won in the United States. What do you mean by that?
I think that now we assist a huge transformation of the global system. Trump, in my opinion, is something very special. It is not just a charismatic leader, but he represents a kind of ideology that changes the balance of the power in the world. So we have the different United States, not the stronghold and the headquarter of globalism, but the kind of sovereign national state, global power with traditional values as well, with totally different agenda on the international affair. And in these new conditions, I think that Putin's Russia and Putin personally stops to be the main enemy, the main evil guy, bad guy. So I think that Trumpists and the followers of Trump will understand much better what Russia is, who Putin is, and the motivation of our politics. So we have now immediately, we have discovered many points that are common for United States of America, Trump's America, and Putin's Russia.
Would it be fair to say is what you're saying is that there is now a kind of deep ideological alignment between Trump and Trumpism and Putinism, and it is against Europe. The United States and Russia, in that sense, are now together. And European liberalism, is in some sense the new enemy.
We have many points in common with Trump's America, much more than it seems on the surface. But maybe it is too early to speak about the real alliance between U.S. and Russia against Europe, because it is not against Europe. It is against globalism. But nevertheless, I think that if, for example, Trump would withdraw United States from the war against us in Ukraine, there could be a situation that we will fight against European globalists, European liberals in Ukraine without America. So I think that Trump, sooner or later, and maybe sooner than we presume, he will discover that Putin has absolutely nothing against United States. No reason to continue the fight. No reason to oppose or to no field of competition. And that is different from China.
Money makes the world go round and round.
One in the United States of America. And second, my question, he basically says that if United States of America stops supporting Ukraine, then Russia and the United States can fight together against European globalism. So basically, I don't even, what is it, the World War III, but, in some different configuration than it was back in 1939. So what do you say?
Well, actually, I'm not all that surprised by all this. I mean, it's kind of weird, but I met Dugin 25 years ago when he'd just written his book on the pivot of history. And I met him when I was doing the research for the book with Clifford Gaddy on Siberia back in very early 2000. I'd gone to Kazan to a conference. And I was there with Mikhail Tulman, who from Die Zeit, who's also written a book about kind of Putin and Putin's kind of revanchism, etc. And we spent an entire day, just the two of us, with Aleksandr Dugin. I'd not met him before, but I do remember that our Tatar host said, "Oh, you must meet him. He's a fascist." And this is in the early 2000s. And I thought, well, what does that mean, a Russian fascist? In that kind of context. Well, anyway, then I met Aleksandr Dugin, and I quickly realized that basically this is somebody who's kind of obsessed with basically passing out this whole, as I said, these pivots of history. We spent most of our time talking about Sir Halford Mackinder, who many of you will know who that is, of course, who wrote that a pamphlet in 1904. So this is really what he's taking us back to, about, kind of basically the pivot of history, the fulcrum, and it obviously being on the Eurasian landmass. And at that point, there was Britain and the kind of the Great Sea empires. The United States was kind of part of that. And his whole thesis at the time was that through the revival of Eurasianism, that Russia would be back in its kind of rightful place in the world and probably would cooperate with the United States as the great ocean-going powers. So he actually was thinking about things like this back, 25 years ago. And I mean, interesting enough, there's more of a hearkening here to 1984, not just 1904. I've had a number of students come up to me at various talks, not unfortunately with either your book or my book, Lucian, but carrying copies of 1984 that they've got from their grandparents, kind of all, kind of bundled up in their pockets and saying, aren't we in 1984, where we have Oceania, East Asia, and, kind of basically Eurasia, dividing the world up among them. And that's a very Halford Mackindian, but it's also an Aleksandr Dugin thinking. So this is kind of vintage Aleksandr Dugin. But what he's touching upon is actually a very perplexing and troubling set of circumstances, which, I'm sure that Lucian will also speak to here. That indeed, if the US is kind of pulling away from support of Ukraine, that in fact does leave Europe exposed to a war that is with Russia, but where Russia is backed not perhaps by the United States, although, I think that we are seeing Trump trying to draw closer to Putin and to reset the relationship in ways that he wanted to in his first term, to be frank, but one that is actually supported by China, by North Korea and Iran. So we're in a actually rather difficult position for Europe, and this raises a lot of questions about European security, which is why, of course, Europeans, are trying to figure out what to do. I mean, Dugin himself is a kind of a throwback, no offense to gentlemen with beards, but to, kind of a different, kind of peer of Tolstoy. And he's been cultivating this for the last 25 years. His beard is just longer and grayer now than when I first met him.
And Tolstoy was a pacifist.
Yes, but which is ironic, of course. But he did talk a lot about Solzhenitsyn and Tolstoy and, many others in that very first odd encounter that was seared on my memory, forever as well. But it's kind of vintage Dugin. I'm not surprised in the slightest that you're seeing things in this way.
You mentioned, I will ask you, Lucian, a question, but very quickly, you mentioned China, and just recent news, has reported capturing Chinese citizens fighting alongside Russian forces. So would you say that Chinese are ready to put boots on the ground?
Well,
yes,
I'll
please.
bring Lucian in here because
Well,
he's been looking at this battle for some time.
Well, I also saw that report. What it seems like what we're looking at with these Chinese soldiers is more probably troops that were recruited there. And I think what this indicates too is also Russia's desperation to find troops from other countries. The fact that North Koreans are fighting there, but is one indication. Of course, that was an offering from Kim Jong-un to get into Putin's good graces because he saw a lot of benefits from getting North Koreans to fight.
Just added another 3,000 soldiers or troops, North Koreans. Mm-hmm.
But we know that there are also hapless Indians and Nepalese and people from all sorts of backgrounds that are being somehow recruited, even unwitting, into this war and find themselves on the front line. So I think one way of reading it is I don't think this is necessarily with any Chinese state sanction, but we are looking at a situation where Russia is really desperate to find the manpower.
But so you don't think that these Chinese are, in any way that China sent, a battalion, say, or something like that? No. You don't think that just some Chinese, crossed the border on Amur River and just went all the way, got to Ukraine?
Well, we know that there have been recruitment efforts, right?
In China?
That we don't know. But I mean, in other places, for example, in India. So I don't know.
China is a surveillance state. There are cameras in each and every lavatory. So, I just cannot imagine how it's possible to recruit Chinese soldiers without knowledge of the Russian.
There are lots of Chinese. Well, we have to find out, first of all, were they actually soldiers or have they been trained in Russia, right? So were they members of the Chinese military? That's an open question and perhaps not as likely as Lucian is saying. But I think Lucian is absolutely right that Russia is recruiting everywhere. Lots of Central Asians, particularly those with dual nationality and passports, as you mentioned, in India, some without. Yeah, and the question is whether these are Chinese who were, working in the Russian Far East or, elsewhere in Russia that have been recruited. If you talk to Paul Whelan, basically the American who was kept, hostage in Russia after being seized, he'll tell you all kinds of stories of people he met in jail. And I hope he'll, at some point come. You should probably have him come and speak. It's actually a fascinating insights into the way that recruitment was taking place for the front. People being swept up, being arrested, ending up in Russian detention, and then being sent to the front. For example, of all kinds of different backgrounds and nationalities and citizenship status. I think what's going to be the most important point is how China responds to this, and how the Chinese state deals with this in their bilateral relationships with Ukraine. And also, how they deal with this publicly. That might tell us a lot. Because as I said, the real, kind of question is now, if the United States is not just switching sides, but is moving out of the conflict, because China, North Korea, and Iran have seen this as a proxy war against the United States, and they've been very open in telling the Ukrainians this. It's not about you. It's really about our relationships with the United States. How do they then, react to the US shift? Do they continue to support Russia in its war against Ukraine? Because this is now a European war very clearly, and one about the future of Europe and European security.
Judging by the latest piece published in the New York Times, this huge investigation about the war in Ukraine, we found out that there was a joint headquarters, Ukrainian and Americans, in Wiesbaden, in Germany. And that apparently, yes, we did know that Americans were instrumental in providing intelligence for Ukrainian, missiles and for their attacks. But now, from judging from this investigation, especially at the first part of the war, Americans were instrumental in helping Ukraine. To some extent, it is a war a proxy war between Russia and the United States, not? What would you say?
Lucian?
Well, it has certain, I mean, you bring up a good point. I mean, there are certain characteristics, and this is, of course, what the official Russian narrative has been from the beginning, that they use their favorite phrase, the collective West, that we're fighting the collective West. And so certainly reports that come out showing the depth of the U.S. involvement would seem to confirm that. At the same level, as someone who's spent a lot of time in Ukraine, in the last year, I would say there's also quite a lot of there's been such a high level of frustration with the Americans. So even though that there was this joint staff in Germany doing, it seems like its main purpose was to figure out what were the proper weapons that should be supplied to the Ukrainians. At the same time, there was such a deep level of frustration with the Biden administration and at the speed with which weapons were being delivered, that what was interesting, I was just in Ukraine in February, and I didn't hear the name Joe Biden one single time. It's not like I felt like even anybody really was missing the Biden administration, which is maybe surprising. And I heard those signals already last summer. There was the naive hope, I think, you can't say naive hope, that people thought Trump, despite his record already in Ukraine and during his first term, that he would somehow be able to rattle up the situation enough that there would be a better outcome than if the war simply continued in its present direction. Of course, I think now, just in the last couple of weeks, I think the Ukrainians have been disabused of those illusions.
Yeah, but did you see? I traveled also, through Ukraine in March of 2023. I never met. There were a lot of Americans, of course, in Kyiv, but nowhere in the west or in the south where I was. I didn't see any. I didn't see any Americans. But still, I keep asking myself, if this war was so essential for so existential even for the United States.
It wasn't, though. That's the whole point.
But then why did you allow yourself to lose the war?
Who allowed themselves to lose the war?
You? Americans?
Me? Or Lucian or the audience? You mean
No,
Americans?
I'm so sorry. I mean, the government of the United States of America, everybody was saying, everything was too little too late. Judging by this piece in the New York Times, with long investigation, it turned out that there was the possibility to finish this war in the summer of 2023.
Well, I think you've just put your finger on it about there's a big difference between what military assistance was trying to accomplish, which is to help Ukraine defend itself, potentially turn the tide, and a political sense, getting back to what Lucian has just said about the disappearance of Joe Biden, that it wasn't an existential conflict. I mean, if you think about it right from the very beginning, President Biden made it very clear that his number one goal was to avoid World War III nuclear Armageddon. World War III, and Trump's been talking about the same thing, defined as a nuclear exchange. And if your number one goal was to kind of basically avoid a nuclear war with Russia, that's not the same as actually kind of basically persecuting a war that would allow Ukraine to win. I mean, I've been, many of you have all been in the same, position. If you were doing a kind of a decision tree and your number one, goal was avoiding nuclear war at all costs, then all the other things about Ukraine come much lower down. But for military people who are set to a task, which is about, how do you help Ukraine defend itself, then, of course, they're going to be setting up a very different set of decision tree to figure out, as Lucian pointed out, in Wiesbaden, rather than with boots on the ground, how they're going to help Ukraine figure out what kind of weapons systems it wants. But all the time, there's been a constraint on, basically going on the offensive. And you remember that General Milley, made it very clear, what was it now, a year and a half or so ago, maybe 2 years ago, that he thought that the Ukrainians should dig in and it should basically be defending the line. And that would be the line of contact as it was then, and really kind of lean into that defensive war. But at the time, Ukrainians didn't want to do that because that would have meant giving up the opportunity of retaking back Ukrainian territory. So there's always been these kind of competing things going on at the same time with different levels of engagement, different viewpoints and different goals established. Now, of course, Ukrainians always wanted to win the war. And that's why that's been always very explicit for them, because it is existential for them. And that's kind of basically what you've been trying to cover the whole time, Lucian. But it's not been existential for the United States. And again, that gets to the complexity of what China and North Korea and Iran and others have thought that they were doing, around the war, or what Europe was doing. A lot of Europeans were actually of the view, well, the United States has decided to step in, so maybe we don't. And now an awful lot of Europeans, not the UK, it has to be said, and the Poles and Balts and many others, are now realising this is actually existential for them now too.
Okay, citing one of our common friend, Americans did want Ukrainians to win, but not too fast, unquote.
But nobody defined what win was. I mean, Lucian, you could probably talk to this because you tried to talk about this in the book as well.
Sorry, who was saying?
Well, people have been saying that they want, Ukraine to win, but not too fast. Well, some people.
So to bleed Russians, to bleed Russian economy, to exhaust it, so to destroy, Putin, at the
some
expense
people
of
have
Ukrainians.
Said that, but that wasn't necessarily the Biden administration's policy.
Well, and it seems, even I heard that frustration last summer already in Ukraine, because for a long time you were hearing from Russians, oh, those Americans, they're ready to fight, us until the last Ukrainian. But then I started hearing that same thing from Ukrainians, that, the Americans want us to fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian. So I think, again, it was that level of frustration and the inability to understand what the Americans actually wanted, because simply, to keep, at some point there was a lot of Ukrainians had the feeling that they were simply being sustained, and as opposed to be given the equipment and the weaponry to actually succeed and to actually win.
Thank you. Russian sources report that the first round of talks between United States and Russia representatives, which happened, in Saudi Arabia, lasted 12 hours. The second round lasted for 9 hours. So what did they discuss that took it that long? 12 hours and 9 hours. You probably, Fiona, you took part in many negotiations, including, these semi-secretive negotiations in Geneva and etc. What did they could discuss for 12 hours? Do you think that they were discussing, really Ukraine, or there was something else like, the discussions between Churchill and Stalin, in 1944?
Look, you've got to, I've talked about this in other settings. You've also got to think that the people around Trump, most of them who are going to these negotiations or discussions, have never met with Russians before. You've got Witkoff, who is a real estate. Maybe real estate deals take 12 hours or 9 hours. I don't know. I've never been in a New York real estate deal. I'm sure they take a lot of time getting to know the person. They don't know anything about Russia or Russians, or even, the terms of what Russia is putting on the table. Now, we do know that a lot of these meetings were taking part in English, which is different, because previously you could have said, well, they have to be translated, so that takes up a lot of time. I don't think you can say that this time around, because people like Ushakov and Lavrov and Kirill Dmitriev, their English is impeccable. It's better than mine, not joking here. These are, amazing, diplomats on the Ushakov and Lavrov front who've just been round the block over and over again. But on the US side, although you've still got people that, I and others, worked with, graduates of the, the RICA program, who are still there in the State Department and in the intelligence service who prepared materials, they're not there with them. So, and maybe they haven't even bothered to read their materials. So they're just kind of getting to know them and getting to know the situation. And we know from some of the statements, and you can speak to this as well, that the statements that were made by the Russians just rehashing the whole kind of history of US-Russian interaction over the last several years. They're just kind of picking up where they, left off before, yet rehashing, the same things, the bilateral irritants, the terms that we used. Basically, they're kind of going back to the basics and kind of starting again. So I'm not surprised it would take 12 hours or 9 hours.
It's my understanding that those talks were on a pretty technical level, and that's why the talks that were really important were Steve Witkoff's 2 meetings with Putin, which I think both of them lasted at least 3 hours.
Yeah, probably Putin gave him a lecture on the
Sure.
on the Russian and Ukrainian history, in which
And
Ukraine
he was
didn't
ready
exist.
to ready to repeat that in his interview with Tucker Carlson.
Yeah. And I mean, remember how long Putin talked to Tucker Carlson in the same way. And Tucker Carlson kept saying, is this relevant, Mr. President? And Putin said, yes, of course it is. And then he went on again. So I can just imagine, just as Lucian says, that this was a lot of being talked at. And then the question is, what did they take from that? And then the technical issues do take some time to thrash out.
I tend to think, though, that the Steve Witkoff meetings were maybe more flattery, because in the Tucker Carlson interview, Steve Witkoff claims that he was not manipulated by Putin. And then he turns around, and the next second he's saying that Putin presented him with a beautiful portrait of Donald Trump, which he took back to the White House. So, the inability to understand that you've just contradicted what you just said is rather astounding.
Right. There were reports that agreement was reached on specific ceasefire, such as those concerning energy infrastructure. However, in the last 2 weeks, Russian forces attacked the Ukrainian city Sumy. 70 people, people killed and wounded. Kyiv, 4 people killed, including a dad and his son. Kryvyi Rog, a missile hit the children's playground. 9 children aged 3 to 17 killed. Finally, while visiting the new submarine in Severodvinsk, on the bank of, that's the city, closed city on the bank of the White Sea, Putin said, "Мы добьем Ukraine. We will finish off Ukraine." So what kind of ceasefire or peace negotiations are there,
Yeah. You got it, yeah.
But so
Should
what?
we answer more?
But so you want to say that there is no really any negotiations? But, people say that President Trump is, does want to get a peace deal. And to be honest with you, Fiona, I did think that if anybody, Trump was capable of doing this because he's as cynical as Putin is. But apparently, I just really don't understand what it's all about. Then what did they talk about 12 hours and then 9 hours?
I think it's actually, Lucian, just jump in here as well. I think it's fairly straightforward. Trump wants a ceasefire. He wants to be able to say that he's brought a peace deal. Neither Putin nor Zelensky asked him to negotiate or to mediate. And as the rest of the world has thought that the US was a party to the conflict, it's also kind of a bit complicated here. To mediate, Trump is always talking about, the Nobel Peace Prize, as we know, and Teddy Roosevelt. And many of the people here in this room know about the Portsmouth Peace Treaty. It's just up the road. After the Russo-Japanese War. In that case, Teddy Roosevelt was asked to mediate by both Russia and Japan. And the United States was a neutral party back in the 1900s. It had no real beef with either Russia or Japan. And this was a real negotiation. The people of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, were basically part of this. It was a great act of public diplomacy. It was in the Wentworth Hotel. It was in a kind of a neutral space, and they thrashed it out, basically with a bit of mediation. That's not what's happening here. Trump is trying to force, basically, a peace deal, and it now seems to be on Russia's terms. But it's really, from the point of view that he has all the leverage, as he told Zelensky, all the cards, when it comes to Ukraine. Because from his view, and look, we all heard what he said in the Oval Office. He made it very clear that he thinks that America made Zelensky a tough guy, that, yes, America has been basically making this war feasible, and this is what Lucian can really speak to for Ukraine. And therefore, if he decides to withhold US arms and intelligence, he can force Ukraine to basically, at least on its part, hold to a ceasefire. But he never obviously got any agreement from Putin at all. He got a portrait, he apparently got prayers, and he got, all kinds of opportunities to have a chat to Putin as he kind of wanted. And he's now getting a whole host of discussions about the reset of the US-Russian relationship, which is something that he wants. But his ability to actually have a genuine ceasefire that's two-sided, not just one-sided, and a peace deal remains elusive. Because for Putin, this is all about the US-Russian relationship. And Putin's goals for Ukraine, which Lucian lays out pretty clearly in his book, have not changed at all. So Trump, can't do anything and basically provide for Putin anything that he particularly wants at this moment.
And so to follow up on that, so what we're seeing is actually a decoupling of bilateral relations between Russia and the United States on one hand and the Ukraine war. And you asked Zhenya, so, what were they talking about? I think what they were also talking about, especially Kirill Dmitriev, when he was in Washington last week, was about deals. This is what we can do together. And this is something that, again, also came up in the Tucker Carlson Witkoff interview. Wouldn't it? Just think of all the great things we could do together in outer space and AI.
Like what?
Just think about it.
The space issues are real because, NASA and, the Russian Space Agency.
Mars.
It's Mars, exactly as just Lucian's saying here. What was also interesting, one of the things that Kirill Dmitriev did announce somewhat after Rio, he said he was going to be talking to Elon Musk. So there's a Musk factor in all of this as well. And he said that they were going to talk about spaceflight, including to Mars. And also, interestingly, about the whole issue of atomic energy, and Rosatom was going to be, part of these discussions as well. The U.S.-Russian space cooperation was actually one of the great bright spots of the whole kind of period after the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you think about for Elon Musk, who's also been having his own conversations with Putin and others, this is probably a childhood dream come true. What's the country that created, the first space rocket? It's Russia. It was thought of by, a credible autodidact, fairly quirky guy, a little bit like Elon Musk himself, Tsiolkovsky, out there, in Kaluga in the middle of nowhere in the 1880s and 1890s. It's an amazing story. And if you're a space wonk, I kind of love some of these stories as well. What a dream come true to be able to work with the Russian space sector. First man in space, first dog in space, first woman in space, and then first possibility of getting to Mars. But it's all about this at the moment. And I think, the sky is the limit is basically, or Mars is the limit of some of these discussions. It's about all kinds of other things, but not what's happening on terra firma in Ukraine.
Space industry in Russia is basically in ruins.
Yes, but
Russians failed time and again.
This is an opportunity, to put this on another path. And for somebody like Musk, this is I honestly, genuinely think this is a dream. Come true.
And I think so going forward, I do think that we will see a wider separation and kind of a certain dissonance between what's happening in U.S.-Russian bilateral relations and what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. And they will no longer be sort of mutually contradictory. They will just be two different things as far as the Trump administration sees it.
And Trump has seen it like that from the very beginning, honestly. He keeps saying over and over again, and people don't necessarily listen to him, this has not got anything to do with me, Ukraine, nothing to do with me at all. In the very first conversation that he had with Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, she said something to him about, what are you going to do with Ukraine? And he said, what do you mean, Angela? What am I going to do with Ukraine? What are you going to do about Ukraine? What's it got to do with me? That was Obama and, all those kind of people, beforehand. I had nothing to do with Ukraine. So he's been pretty consistent. And now he'd really like nothing to do with Ukraine. He would like to have this ceasefire and hand it off.
Fiona, you advised Prime Minister of Great Britain and President of France on their strategy with respect to Putin and, especially as far as I understand, if Russia will start the war against Ukraine. So EU does have money, but it doesn't have army. United Kingdom does have army to a certain extent, at least that's what some specialists whom I asked told me that United Kingdom does have, but of course no better. Will you expect deployment of British or French or both as peacekeeping forces in Ukraine? And do you think that Europe, given the position of the President of the United States, will be able to help Ukrainians to end this war at least?
Well, I think these are all complicated and also very different questions because, we're so far from a peace plan or kind of basically a peace process. These negotiations, I think, as we've all, kind of agreed, are much more about U.S.-Russia at this point than they are about Ukraine. And even, in the case of a ceasefire, look what's just happened in Gaza. I mean, the ceasefire seems to have vanished, entirely. All of these things are pretty tenuous in any case. We know that from any conflict. When we think about the Balkans, for example, I mean, it took a long time, before we really were able to get something in motion there. So, there's a possibility for Europe to help Ukraine hold the line, and deny Putin the ability to move further forward. But that, is kind of a different set of discussions. But we're way away from peacekeeping. I think what you heard Keir Starmer and Macron others saying that if there was really genuinely a peace deal, and if Trump was able miraculously 24 hours, if he was really correct that Putin had promised him all kinds of things to happen, then they would be prepared to do something, basically to send a signal this is about Europe as well. And it's France and the UK, because France and the UK have the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, the ARC, which is kind of part of the sort of NATO reaction, but it's kind of done through a bilateral arrangement between France and the UK. But these Allied Reaction Corps before were meant for more expeditionary activities, which is, a bit different from what we would be, dealing with on the ground in Ukraine. But Europe is now talking very seriously about the whole future of European security. The war in Ukraine is seen as like World War I, World War II, a massively pivotal event. It is the largest land war in Europe since World War II that changes everything. And if the United States is doing what it has often done in times of history, which is pulling out again after 80 years of being the most consequential military power in Europe and is pulling itself out, that means that Europe has to start thinking very seriously about the future. And the war in Ukraine becomes that pivotal moment. And what they do with Ukraine becomes very important as well. And of course, Ukrainians have put 800,000 men in the field. And they've also, turned around their whole defense industrial base. They're producing drones themselves, they're producing armaments themselves. Ukraine is a completely different place than it was before, not just in terms of losses of territory and losses of population, but in terms of the whole way it thinks about defence, more like Finland. And Finland was after World War II. So we're seeing a massive change here. So it's, in a way, we're kind of distracted by this whole talk of ceasefire, peace negotiations and sending in peacekeepers, when really something bigger and more fundamental is taking place. I don't know what you would, say from your time in Ukraine as well. I think there's definitely a dramatic shift here that's going on within Europe and how Europeans think about their defense.
How long will it take for Europeans to build an army? People, once again, I'm talking, I know nothing about that. I spoke to some specialists and they say that there are still, each country produce jeeps and, there is no coordination. And even though we think about European Union, Spain, her contribution is 1.2% GDP. She couldn't care less. And, anyway, so do you expect European Union really to stand up and to how long will it take to prepare?
Well, the European Union isn't going to do that because that's not the role of the European Union. And it's the European pillar of NATO that we're really talking about. And then other bilateral relationships. And I mean, I want to bring, Lucian in, on this as well about how it looks from the Ukrainian perspective. But there's actually a lot more capacity in Europe than we're giving it credit for. There's also all kinds of arrangements. There's something called the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is all the Nordic, countries and the Baltic countries, all of which spend way more than 2% of GDP. And it's not about the percentage of GDP, it's what they actually do and, what they can, what the capacity they have. Finland, which is a country of 5.5 million people, has a standing army of 125,000 and can pull up even more. Look, Ukraine, overnight, created a massive army because it had to out of necessity. If countries have to mobilize, they will do it in the face of a threat. But the big question is, what happens in the future of Ukraine, getting back to, what we're talking about and what Europeans see as their future long-term threat. And there's all kinds of threats that don't require having hundreds of thousands of people in the field. You've just probably been reading in the press about these sensors washing up on shore from, Russian ships that were clearly meant to be, basically picking up data from the seabed about undersea cables and pipelines. For the UK, one pipeline from Norway carries 70% of UK's gas. I mean, we talked about what happened with Nord Stream.
And there were Russian submarines just recently, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, so that there's critical national infrastructure that's at risk. There's, GPS blocking. There's all kinds of things that could happen. There's poisonings and assassinations and acts of sabotage. There's all kinds of things happening in Europe that have to be addressed. And then there's what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. And I'll push back over there to what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, because that has to be factored in about where the state of play is in Ukraine right now. Because what is it that Europeans could do, the most to help Ukraine at this point?
Right. I mean, I don't think it's what can the European Union do. I agree with Fiona. I mean, I think we are looking at what they're calling a coalition of the willing that can be much broader than the European Union, and certainly a country like Turkey could play a key role in a coalition of the willing. So, I mean, inside Ukraine...
Wait a second, you think that Erdogan will go against Putin?
He already is.
Really?
Well, look, because, I mean, they're limiting access to the Black Sea, as they are supposed to do with the Montreux Convention in times of war. So the Black Sea fleet of the Russians is not being replenished by ships coming from the Baltic. And who provided Ukraine with drones in the first instance? Anyway, back to Lucian again. But just to be clear that, Turkey is doing various things.
Turkey is walking a very fine line, also because of its energy dependence on Russia and its quite large bilateral trade. So I think in Ukraine there is a lot of the only hope that the Ukrainians have now is on the Europeans somehow getting their act together. But again, I mean, you asked, how long is it going to take to create a European army? How long is it going to take to have an integrated Ukrainian defense, a European defense industry that's also capable of supplying the Ukrainians? And for the moment, it's still only the United States that can sort of pull together enough resources to supply the Ukrainians. So it's often, I think, when we're talking about what the Europeans can do, we're talking about something that's happening in the midterm or longer term. And for the Ukrainians, this could become an issue of this summer when the last U.S. aid runs out.
Yeah, can I just add on to this, just to make it very clear to people? You're not creating a European army. What you're thinking about is how existing European armies come together. Because the United States has been the glue there in terms of leadership, within NATO, the Supreme Allied Commander, General Cavoli, who, recently testified and actually made it clear that Ukraine's in better shape than, people have been giving it credit for. But it's that kind of leadership, and then it's the equipment, as Lucian talked about, that's pretty critical. The Europeans probably could fill in for US equipment, but over time, because they need a bridging capacity. There's also the intelligence, but, there's intelligence collected by Europeans as well. It's just that the United States is to scale all the time. But look, if the US pulls out of Europe, Finnish troops don't pull out of Europe, Turkish troops don't pull out of Turkey, British troops don't pull out of Britain. You see what I'm saying here? These are voluntary contributions of those national armies to a larger European endeavour. There is a European army because there are European armies. It just depends on how they configure themselves and how they organise themselves. They can use basically the frameworks of NATO. The NATO policy plans don't disappear. They've already been training and operating. And there are sub-NATO entities like the Joint Expeditionary Force that has a headquarters in Britain. And it's, again, like I said before, it includes all of the Scandinavian and the Baltic countries. They could add on Poland to this. There are relationships between the UK and France, we mentioned before, Germany and France, and Germany and the UK. And, there's all kinds of other bilateral and regional relationships that could come into play. It's just a question of time. And then the question is, what are you doing? Are you helping bolster Ukraine? Or are you kind of defending your own territory against Russia? Or what other kinds of operations are you conducting? And all of that is being discussed. And it's, as you said, though, they're having to discuss it in real time very fast, because within the 100 days of Trump, everything has been turned on its head.
Europe lived with two Germanies, right, for 40 years. Moldova has a secession region for almost 30 years. Germany reunited, and Russia is lacking resources to support Transnistria. Would you envision two Ukraines, pro-European West and pro-Russian East, as an outcome of this ceasefire, whatever?
I think that's the most likely outcome of any ceasefire. I mean, that's the Trump administration has made it clear that they expect Ukraine to cede territory. So the idea that somehow in the foreseeable future, Crimea or Donetsk would end up in Ukrainian hands is almost hard to imagine. So I think.
What about Mariupol, Zaporozhye, Khersonskaya Oblast, Kherson region?
Well, I mean, including those areas, Ukraine doesn't have the military force to reconquer them. But where I think it's the difference with, I mean, you talked about East and West Germany. Of course, East Germany was still a country, right? And the problem is that these areas that we're talking about are now, integrated into the Russian constitution and into the Russian state. And how are you ever going to, pry them back out is hard to imagine. It's even not really comparable so much to the Baltic states, because the Baltic states had their own languages and their very distinct identities, whereas these regions are depopulated to a large extent and ravished by war and are being populated by people coming from Russia. So I think even the whole character of a lot of those regions is changing.
Which is obviously a deliberate policy on the part of Putin.
That's exactly what Soviets did after the war with Baltic nations. They sent half of the population to Siberia and they brought Russians to settle there.
But you'd already, on the language, so many people are making the argument that these regions belong with Russia because they're predominantly Russian speaking. I mean, all of us know here that language is not the only bearer of identity. We're all speaking English, but I don't think any of you guys think you're English, right? Even I don't think I'm English, so that's a kind of another kind of question.
Don't tell an Irishman that he's English, right?
Because that's what I'm saying. Because part of my heritage is Irish and Scots and Welsh, and so I'm confused, like most people, So this is kind of a problem, though, is basically that the Russian state is actually saying if you speak Russian, you are a Russian, and the idea of people identifying with Ukraine and Ukrainian language in Russia has come under attack. Even in the most recent census, you saw the number of people self-identifying as Ukrainian, really massively reduced from 2000. Back in 2000, you could say there was like 11 million, I think it was, people who identified as Ukrainian and might have had Ukrainiets, in their passport. But, that's kind of been diminished. But that's what happens over time. If you went around in England and asked everybody with a Scottish last name if they thought they were Scottish, they would probably say not, or even with an Irish last name. That's over time, those identities, tend to fade. And that's what basically Putin is banking on, that there will be no way for Ukraine later to, try to take back Zaporizhye and Kherson and everything else as well. Look, even reincorporating the eastern parts of Germany in Germany has proven difficult. Look at the voting patterns for Alternative for Deutschland. And I was in Germany 2 years ago and Lucian lived there for many years, doing a lot of interviews of people in what was formerly East Germany. And they said they didn't feel parts of the new Germany because they did have their own state. And you can speak to that, the experience that you had being in Germany for so long. That wasn't an easy transition. So even miraculously, if those areas came back, it wouldn't be that easy.
And if I just want to add one point to that is these regions that we're talking about, these four regions plus Crimea, that was never the goal. I mean, incorporating them into Russia was never Putin's goal.
Right.
He said on the eve of the full-scale invasion, we have no plans to occupy any Ukrainian territory. And I don't think he was lying. I think his idea was we are going to have a shock and awe invasion. We will decapitate the Ukrainian government, and we will install a puppet sympathetic regime that will not require us to occupy these regions. So, of course, everything has gone completely differently than what Putin wanted. And he's almost had to incorporate these regions into Russia because no one else is controlling them. But that's not, he's not going to be happy. I mean, Steve Witkoff also said it in his interview with Tucker Carlson that well, maybe they should get these regions because they had these fake referenda. Of course, that's not what it's about. Putin is not going to rest until Ukraine is subordinated to the Kremlin. And so, moving some borders around, this is not what this conflict is about.
Russian army was supposed to occupy Odessa in August 2022. That was the initial plan. So it wasn't just, to occupy Kyiv and retract and just topple the government and retract. But, obviously there was more efficient plan because for some reasons Russians do want a port of Odessa. And so I'm no longer sure that, that Putin had, this short-term goal. To be honest with you, there was several plans and anyway.
I would just say to that though, Zhenya, I think Putin was always willing to just take what he could get.
Yeah.
So you can have different stages of a plan. You might not have enough military to occupy it, but, over time, and I know we've got colleagues from Georgia here, we talk about creeping occupation, reoccupation of Georgia. I think scaling that up is really kind of part of the goal. And what was happened in Georgia, with a kind of complete reversal of Georgia's position and diluting of its, identity again, return of Russian language. We were talking about this a little bit earlier today. That would be, kind of another possibility of Ukraine if you could pull that off. Odessa, absolutely. I mean, I worried actually when I heard Witkoff talking about ports. I thought, God, were they talking about Odessa? Because that was, if you look back to 2014, in fact, when, basically was all of these insurgent movements are being encouraged in Donetsk and Luhansk. And, remember also in Odessa, there was this effort, the whole idea of Novaya Russia, of going back to the period of, Catherine the Great's acquisitions. And that's what Putin was trying to tell Tucker Carlson. Look, anything that we ever touched in the past, everything that we ever had a treaty of, everything that we ever occupied, and giving him the letters from Bogdan Khmelnytsky, in 1647 and 1648. You see, this all kind of belongs to us. Anything we had before, is up for grabs. I think that, still, as Lucian is suggesting, there's still all of those kind of ideas there. They haven't gone away, and he'll take what he can get in whatever way he can.
Peace deal. United States proposed a plan which presupposed a huge investment of the United States in Ukraine. However, I spoke with some people who are involved with those plans, both in Washington and in Kyiv. And I asked them about, the deal, and the answer was that in order to get rare earth elements worth $500 billion, United States will have to invest more than $1 trillion. So, one person told me that it probably will be $1.5 trillion, assuming that, some money will get lost in the middle. So, but some other people, they say that that deal, can serve as a sort of a security guarantee to Ukraine. If the U.S. take control over major ports in Ukraine and gas pipeline, Putin will think twice before bombing Ukraine. So what do you think about that? So two sides of this story. That, it's not about really, ports or pipeline or Ukrainian resources. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's important to remember the prehistory of this so-called minerals deal, that when the election campaign in the U.S. was still in full swing, Volodymyr Zelensky actually proposed some kind of minerals deal in what he called a victory plan, which he presented here in the United States. He presented it to the Biden administration, but the part about the minerals deal seemed especially aimed also at Donald Trump, this offering a very transactional deal. And so what I find rather astounding is almost within a week or so of taking office, the Treasury Secretary traveled to Kiev with this deal, which seemed at that point pretty half-baked, and really it was presented to the Ukrainians as an ultimatum. And of course, we know that it's now gone through several iterations. It was supposed to be signed on February 28th when Zelensky had his unfortunate meeting in the Oval Office, and it has since then been revised. And what we're hearing is that, of course, it's much more now than rare earths, that it includes all of Ukraine's natural resources.
Energy and ports. That's the most important.
And that it's an extremely expansive agreement that includes that involves a fund that would be controlled by the United States.
Right, but don't you think that it can be some sort of a Marshall Plan, the way the United States created this fund back to rebuild Germany and Europe in general?
No, because I think exactly the point that your context were saying about the initial investment. You need to attract private American business to Ukraine if you want to develop those resources. And I have a hard time imagining any American companies investing so much money in a country with such an uncertain future. So I don't see how this would really give Ukraine any security guarantees.
Fiona,
in a concrete way.
No, I agree, but I think there's also some other things going on as well. I mean, in all these cases, it's not just black and white or and and or. There's always all kinds of other, hidden motivations. In part, I mean, Trump is the master of the art of the deal, and he wants to show that he's got a good deal out of support for Ukraine. So what's the big issue of the moment? It's rare earths and raw materials and minerals. For the 21st, kind of century economy. And everybody seems to be in the business of expanding their territory for those purposes. I mean, Putin himself, remember, was part of the justification for invading Ukraine. I mean, he had some of his own ministers sitting there talking about all of the abundance that Russia was going to acquire from the same probably set of minerals and raw materials and rare earths and agricultural products at one point. I mean that was a feature just not so long ago that I think you were kind of covered in some of your media and certainly in your book. There's also the fact that Kirill Dmitriev and others have told Trump that that the US has lost out on all kinds of business opportunities through sanctions and this rupture in relations. And, that figure of 500 billion and before it was 300 billion has come from Dmitriev saying this is the opportunity lost, to the United States. I mean, there was never that level of investment or of trade between the US and Russia, but it's that idea you've lost something. And Trump's always exaggerating the amount of money that they've been ripped off about. And so he wants to kind of show that the US is being compensated. There was a kind of a shock and awe for his base that he was hoping was going to happen in the Oval Office. And, basically... Zelensky didn't play along. And the other thing is that Trump's all about making deals with him personally. And basically, as you recall, he told Zelensky that any deal that had been made with Obama or Biden or anybody else in previous US administrations with Ukraine was null and void because nobody respected all these previous other idiot presidents. Only people who respected him. That's exactly what he said, remember? And that this deal had to be with him. So there's kind of personal gifting. It's not like a dowry. Getting back to the image you started off of the young lady, having to produce her, her dowry chest and her fine linens. And, is that kind of suitable? I mean, honestly, I've been thinking the same image, that he's not going to marry Zelensky unless he's got a fine dowry to go with it. If he doesn't like the dowry, he's going to, send it back again. And even the whole way it was talked about, that sort of transactional way, kind of having a marriage of convenience, you and me, nothing else before, counts there. But none of this, is equivalent, as Zelensky was pointing out, to some kind of security guarantee. There are also lots of other people who have those same concessions. There's been 30 years of investment, in Ukraine and elsewhere. Other business people, it's just the same with Greenland. The Greenland would be delighted and would have been delighted to have all kinds of US investment. The Danes and the Greenland government made this entirely evident to the United States. But there was more UK and Canadian investment than there was US investment because of the basically the upfront costs, the trillions of investment to extract because of lack of infrastructure. So I mean, it's the same set of problems. So this is all, unfortunately, a game that's going on, and it's not a very nice one. But it's all about appearances, and it's all about trying to kind of show that you're getting something out of everything, and that the United States is not just going to support Ukraine for nothing.
Well, and it makes a caricature of reality in the sense of telling the world this is what it was all about all the time anyway. It was all about resources. Whereas I don't think the United States initially had any interest in Ukrainian resources when the war started.
And that takes us back to Dugin and Sir Halford Mackinder in 1904, when Britain and others had been carving up the world for resources, for colonies, and we now seem to be back in that kind of period again. Certainly, and then Putin, of course, encouraging Trump to think about Greenland in a recent speech.
You know what's interesting? That markets are much more enthusiastic about the perspectives for the peace deal. Goldman Sachs stated yesterday that markets pricing in 70% probability of Ukraine peace deal. Why? What do they understand that at least three of us don't? No, I'm serious.
No, I know you're serious. I'm trying to compose myself to think about this. Lucian, any thoughts while I'm thinking through about what they might understand?
I mean, was there any rationale presented? Or
no. It was just the analysis. And, it's not just JP Morgan. Also, they said, 70% probability. I just, I'm perplexed. You're a capitalist. I am, I'm a Soviet. We understand nothing about that,
Look, I think when it comes to the markets, there's a lot of gambling going on, right? I mean, that's kind of purely what this is in terms of speculation. And there's a kind of certainly a hope all the time that there'll be some breakthrough, particularly on the US-Russian relationship, getting past whether there's going to be a ceasefire and a peace deal in Ukraine, that this is more about the kind of line of travel of the US-Russian relationship. Kirill Dmitriev was, of course, at Goldman Sachs, at one point, and many other places as well. He knows how to play this game. He's probably talking to the markets. That's kind of going to encourage, Trump, to go further in all of this. I mean, well, it's not talking to the markets. I mean, talking to people who talk to analysts who then, try to shape the markets. Because there's this whole idea that there's a lot of money to be made in all of this. That's basically what the message, for Trump and Witkoff and others is. We all need to have this peace deal so we can all make a lot of money. And, what's not to like about making a lot of money? This is kind of like the messaging that's out there. And getting back to what Lucian said, it was all about this all the way along. Putin really did genuinely think that, dealing with Ukraine was all about getting the price, right? Getting the price right. What was Ukraine willing to pay for its freedom or not? What was the cost? He's shown that he's prepared to pay an enormous price and a cost to get what he wants. 800,000 casualties, kind of on the Russian side, not just people killed, but grievously wounded. All of this, efforts, for overall of this time to keep focused on this. It's just getting what's the price that's right. And markets are trying to figure out the same thing. If the US-Russian relationship is going to change, maybe we'll make some money. Maybe the sanctions are going to lift, the financial sanctions. Maybe there's not going to be secondary sanctions. Maybe the US going after the shadow fleet is going to disappear. And lots of people are very willing to go back into Russian financial markets and to trade Russian debt and bonds and things. But whether people are willing to go back and invest in material things in the Russian market is another matter. But if space is kind of in your future and Mars is the limit, all kind of space futures. Look, Elon Musk was selling land on Mars. You can sell anybody anything, it appears. I've got a nice piece of Mars I'd like to sell you.
You did?
Yeah, about a Mars bar, but anyway. Are you selling anything?
Thanks God I have nothing to sell. Lucian, so why did Putin invade Ukraine at the first place? And what are motives that will make him to agree on real ceasefire? I know it's a simple question. But you wrote a book.
I wrote a book about it, and the subtitle is Why Russia Invaded Ukraine. So I identified two main drivers for the Russian invasion. The first driver is Russian imperialism. So it's this idea that Russia has a historic mission to be at the center of a great Eurasian empire. And I think this had a lot to do also with the fall of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the legacy of that empire, which weighed so heavily on so many people. And we certainly know that was the case with Vladimir Putin and his clique. But I also argue that, just this nostalgia for an empire or for the Soviet or the Soviet Union, it's not it's not enough of a motivation then to go ahead and attack your neighbor and try to conquer them. So the other element or main driver that I identified was Putin's dictatorship. So the fact that after 20 years in power, Putin had evolved or devolved, you could say, as a leader, and he increasingly saw his power being threatened by the West, and in his paranoia, I mean, he saw that all these so-called color revolutions were getting closer to his border, and that he was the ultimate target of some kind of regime change in Russia. And so I think the combination of those two things were what ultimately drove him to attack. I do also discuss in my book, what the United States was doing this whole time, what was in fact the role of NATO, and I mean, just to put it very succinctly, I mean, what I found was that there was only one U.S. president that really pushed for Ukraine to join NATO, and that was George W. Bush. And the reason he did it was as a reward for Ukraine taking part in the coalition of the willing and participating in the occupation of Iraq. So that was kind of he was ready to go ahead and push that. Of course, as we know, in 2008 at the famous Bucharest summit, NATO summit, there was a lot of clashing views. The Germans and the French did not want to do that, and they came up with this compromise wording saying one day Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO without any timeline or any kind of guarantee. So that put Ukraine in an extremely vulnerable position, because on one hand the door was open, and from the point of view of the Kremlin, that was a great threat. But on the other hand, they actually had no chance of ever getting in, especially, as I point out in my book, all the subsequent U.S. presidents, Barack Obama, Donald Trump in his first term, and then Joe Biden at the beginning of his term, they were completely uninterested in Ukraine, contrary to the Russian propaganda, or I think also to Putin's paranoia. All of those three presidencies put Russian-U.S. relations at the top. Also what you were talking about earlier, Fiona, that sort of avoiding World War III is sort of paramount importance, and everything else is subordinated to that, including a country called Ukraine. And so, I mean, I find the tragedy of Ukraine's story is that, in fact, no U.S. president actually cared enough about Ukraine, and that it was left in this limbo for such a long time.
I mean, just to add to that, I mean, when I was in the administration, we were always being asked by Russian counterparts, why do you care about Ukraine? And honestly, the interlocutors never came up with real rationale. I remember, Ambassador Bolton said, well, we've got Ukrainian Americans. And then you could see him searching, for like the next thing to say. We're a country that loves freedom, and kind of revolutionary, kind of country, which actually we apparently don't really, but it kind of comes down to it. And, kind of basically that principle of territorial integrity, which frankly, Donald Trump is now blasting all the way through with claims made against Canada and Greenland and Panama. So we were never super convincing that we actually really cared all that much. And in fact, in 2008, it was really more about Georgia, to be honest, than it really was about Ukraine. I
think that was the response, by the way, to Bucharest.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was kind of, Ukraine was there, of course, but the Ukrainians themselves were a bit more ambivalent about NATO at that point. Georgia was all gung-ho. I mean, as you rightly pointing out, there was all the backdrop of Afghanistan and Iraq and coalitions of the willing, and the Ukrainians had this heavy lift capacity and, we thought, at the time, a significant military, which actually they've proven to be the case. But there was a real desire to reward Georgia. And then, I mean, I've got a colleague here in the audience who remembers all of this. We did all these, deep dives and discussions about it. And it was really more about the whole idea of the freedom agenda than it really was about Ukraine and Georgia and democracy, the freedom agenda, the failure, in fact, to nation build in Iraq and, Afghanistan, and thinking that, you might be able to pick this up somewhere else. And, George W. Bush, he liked Georgia and Ukraine. He thought they were plucky countries and, he wanted to support them. But, there wasn't really a thinking through, even though we actually did try to think through what the consequences of all of this would be. And then, as, you point out, there was the invasion of Georgia. And all of that, kind of underscored the fragility on which this was all based. And that should have been a lesson for basically beefing up European and other security at the time, but it wasn't taken that way. It was thought of it was because of Mikhail Saakashvili and, kind of intemperate actions on his part. Ukraine, I think, and Ukrainian leadership at the time read the writing on the wall. And of course, after that, they conclude the Black Sea deal. With the Russians for the longer-term leasing of Sevastopol and the other Black Sea fleet facilities. And actually, they pulled back from pushing on NATO. So, it was only really after Russia seizes Crimea that the whole idea of basically Ukraine going back towards NATO gets back on the table. And as Lucian points out, no one was super interested in putting Ukraine into NATO at that point.
So what kind of incentives Putin has to conclude, to end this awful war and to make some peace deal?
I don't think he really has any incentives at the moment. I think it's more about whether he realizes he can't achieve what he wants to achieve. It's like denying him, the ability to kind of move forward.
I completely agree with Fiona. I would only say he does have an incentive, though, to go into talks.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Right? He has an incentive to normalize the relations with the United States. So I think that's why we see him talking. I mean, he's on the world stage, and I really don't think we should rule out a meeting, maybe in Moscow, between Trump and Putin in the foreseeable future. Whether there's a peace deal or not, I think they can separate these two issues so far that I can certainly imagine that.
I was thinking today a terrible thought because I noticed in the press again that there's a talk about having a military parade on Trump's birthday, which also happens to coincide with something else. I'm sure Vladimir Putin would be very happy to put on a military parade for him.
Right.
So I've said that now, so that if Putin does that, hopefully it'll stop him from doing it, because we've already talked about it at the Davis Centre, so he wouldn't want to talk about that. But because I had off this thought, oh God, what if Putin calls up and says, "Hey, I've got this military parade for you, please come."
But you both said that Putin doesn't have incentives to end this war. But look, he had to give up on Syria. He lost his bases in Syria because he just didn't have resources, troops to support Assad and even to preserve his bases. They were unable to take out their weapons that was, in those bases in Syria. So he's definitely losing. He doesn't have the possibility to sustain, different wars.
But that's what we just said. It's about denial, right? That's not incentives. He wasn't incentivized to leave Syria. He would have liked not to leave Syria. It's because the whole calculation changed. But he couldn't maintain it because the new Syrian government didn't want him to be there.
Right.
And, he lost that because of Assad. Now, I mean, look, he could easily have lost the ability to push forward had not that Trump came with the Trump card. And suddenly, getting back to what you said before about, losing, I mean, basically, Trump is playing a different hand and is basically playing away Ukraine at this particular point. So why would Putin do anything at this point till he sees how this game unfolds?
Because he doesn't have manpower. He has to bring troops from North Korea.
Yeah, but he believes he's got much more manpower than Ukraine has. And because we're all sitting around in meetings, talking about when Ukraine runs out of weapons, I mean, why again? I mean, he's listening all the time to all of this stuff. He's reading the Wall Street Journal. Well, he isn't personally probably, but I mean, he's getting somebody, providing him with all these clips. The Americans are talking themselves out of this again. Europe's talking itself out of relevance. the Ukrainians are going to run out of weapons.
Well, and the U.S. will completely decouple from NATO, or maybe even leave NATO. So the longer.
So why would he?
You agree that US will leave NATO?
But that's what that's what was being talked about. So why at this particular point would Putin do anything? I mean, in Syria, it all kind of went in a different direction.
I think he has to wait, right? I mean, a war of attrition. They believe in a war of attrition. I mean, that no matter how difficult things are for Russia, they're even worse for Ukraine, especially if U.S. aid does now get cut off, and the Europeans are unable to come up with adequate.
Still,
supplies.
oil prices go down. Urals today slightly over $50. Russian budget is sustained at 45 at best. The reason Putin was able to run this war for these 3 years because he was getting $350 billion in oil revenues, and that's what he needed to sustain the war. So if oil prices will go down, if Americans will manage, Saudi Arabia voted for more output. OPEC basically collapsed. So we can envision something, or at least I would like to think that there can be something like the kind of deal that Reagan did with Saudis back in the 1980s, when oil prices collapsed and Soviet Union finally collapsed.
I mean, Putin's watching all of that very carefully, and I think his calculation, even in listening to that, is like, well, no, I still think that I have more advantages here, because he can still keep hanging on. I mean, he's got a really crack team of central bankers and economists around him. He's got people like Kirill Dmitriev running around, kind of all over the place. He's got a Trump who really, 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 really wants to have a deal and to have something that he can point to. And, he's betting on the Europeans not getting their act together. I'd like to bet that Europe would get its act together, but Putin wouldn't agree with me. He'd certainly come to my bet.
Yevgenia, I can actually imagine a scenario in which some sort of ceasefire, peace agreement even comes together, and everyone is overjoyed about it, and especially the market, right? And then what happens? And I think this is what I have been hearing from Ukrainians since last summer. What happens after the shooting stops? And the idea that once domestic politics returns to Ukraine, Ukrainians who have been so unified and so cohesive in fighting an external aggressor will begin to turn on themselves. And I can imagine that this is also one reason why we keep on hearing out of the Kremlin the need for a legitimate leader in Ukraine. We will hear more and more calls for elections, and elections is only, it means opening the Pandora's box of all the internal disputes and aggressions that exist inside of Ukraine. So
and Trump's calling for elections as well. So you've also got the US doing the same thing and shopping around for another Ukrainian president, same as Putin is. And again, it gets back to Georgia. We have some Georgian colleagues, sitting at the back of the auditorium here. That's what happened in Georgia. Everybody started fighting with each other. Once the Russian threat morphed in a different way. And where is Mikhail Saakashvili right now?
In prison.
Correct. And I'm sure that's Trump, probably wouldn't mind seeing Zelensky in jail either, by the way he talked to him. And Putin absolutely most certainly would. I'm sure he would have a live cam feed for Zelensky in whatever prison he ends up in. And I'm sorry to put it in such a crude terms, but that's what they want.
I cannot allow myself for such pessimism. I have too little years to live. And I need to see Putin down and Ukraine free. So, and my country, Russia, free. Thank you so much. And now, questions from the audience. You're so pessimistic. Yes, please. And we have, yes. And then Cris.
Thanks very much to everyone on the panel and also to the Harvard support staff who do important jobs. I have a question for Dr. Kim, and it involves politely dissenting from what you said about the course of Putin's war. It began as a war for influence. It became a war of annexation, and now it's both. The two are not mutually exclusive. And for Ukraine, it is a ramifying tragedy. And not recognizing that tends to let Putin and Russians off the hook. So my question is simple. Would you please, if not tonight, then in the future, would you please reconsider that opinion? Thank you very much.
Okay. Cris. Yeah.
So, Dr. Hill, you have been in the room where it happens, right? You have served under a Trump presidency. I'm wondering what you're seeing now from a Trump 2.0, that what your impression is of their foreign policy direction, if there is one, if you're seeing that things feel largely the same, or is there a difference? And I know there's been so much noise about DOGE and, obviously a lot of domestic issues. Sometimes the foreign policy can get lost. But are you seeing sort of a through line from your experience to what we're seeing now?
Do you want us to respond to these?
That was a question to you.
Yeah,
Fiona.
but I don't know whether, Lucian,
okay.
whether you want to clarify, because I'm not quite sure that that's quite how you describe things, actually. But
So your understanding was that, sorry, you don't have a microphone now.
What would you like me to say?
No. The question, there was a statement. It wasn't a question, Lucian. It was a statement that he wants to, I'm sorry, what's your name, please?
Oh, my name's Tom Johnson. I teach history at UMass Boston.
Yes. So, and he hopes that you will change your view. But really, Fiona, it's very interesting, this question that Cris placed. What's the procedure? I was asking Rory McFarker the other day when we were talking about tariffs. What's the procedure? Who advises Trump? How do they make decision? Who decided that? Yeah.
Look,
how? Who is in the National Security Council? Who covers Russian desk? Are there any people who are capable to tell him, a thing or two about Putin? Or,
Look, we also know that for Putin himself, he made the decision to go into Ukraine with a very small number of people.
Right.
I mean, he made a decision and was encouraged on that. Well, it isn't just really about that. It's about, look, if you're in charismatic, hyper-personalized presidential systems, think Macron in France as well, there aren't always a lot of people who get in the room to be able to talk for anything more than about 2 seconds. I could not say that I advised Trump at all. I mean, he asked me 2 questions directly to me.
But he called you Russian bitch.
Well, apparently to somebody else, but not to my face, thank goodness, because I don't know how to respond. But anyway,
your book.
But it's basically, I didn't get a chance to sit down and say, hey, President Trump, here's my thoughts on the matter. That never happened. And it, doesn't happen with people like Macron. I'm pretty sure that, Putin, didn't ask, for a kind of a great long, appraisal of the situation from, say, Sergei Ryabkov or something like this, or even, Lavrov and others getting a chance to do their kind of spiel on foreign policy. Trump goes with his gut, as he tells everybody. There is a through line of things that he has believed in for a very long time. Tariffs, for example, tariff man, he said that. He's believed in tariffs since the 1980s. He believes in tariffs now. Ukraine, he doesn't believe that, sadly, Ukraine is a country, just like Putin doesn't think Ukraine is a country. And when Putin told him he didn't think Ukraine was a country, Trump agreed with him, right at the very kind of beginning of the Trump presidency. And he says it all the time about this. Maybe it's Russia, maybe it's not Russia. Maybe it'll be an independent country, maybe it won't be an independent country. He's always kind of going with whatever it is that his gut tells him. He would say repeatedly, I know better than you. Always in public, I know better than my generals. He does this all the time. So I think you can really kind of see the answer to this question is that, people will try to get in there. They will, try to shape his views. Why did Witkoff spend so much time talking to Tucker Carlson? Because Trump will watch him on television. Because Witkoff probably wouldn't get more than a few minutes, even though he's a, famous real estate mogul. He's now on the staff. He's basically somebody who's sent out to, basically, go and do things. But he's not going to be able to do a debrief of 12 hours or 9 hours or however long he has. But if he goes and talks to Tucker Carlson, Trump will listen to it. When I was, kind of working in the Trump 1.0, and Ambassador Bolton came in, who was, a very, clever guy when it came to, how to present things. He would go on the Sunday shows every Sunday if he could, so that Trump would have to listen to him, because he wasn't going to have, Trump listen to him if he went in to do his briefing. Trump would listen to, some of his briefers, but, it depended on who they were and what he thought they were.
You mean briefers from the
CIA and others, if he thought that they'd, got some interesting stuff to tell him. But even they had to be figuring out how to present it to him. So this is part of the problem that you have here. And I mean, look, you said at the end we're very pessimistic. I'm not necessarily. I think all kinds of things can happen because everybody has agency. And Trump isn't infallible. He's eminently fallible, but he is a very clever politician. You shouldn't, rule him out, just like Vladimir Putin's been unbelievably lucky. Yes. But, your luck might run out. You might choke on a pretzel, as George Bush almost did, watching television when no one was there and had to do the self-Heimlich maneuver. I always think of that, thinking, God, thank God he knew what to do, because the Secret Service wouldn't have come in. What if Putin's, choking on some borscht right now as we're speaking? A bit late, actually. But anyway, maybe he drowns in his swimming pool or something, if he still swims. There's all kinds of fall down a flight of stairs. I tripped in the street and broke both my wrists. All kinds of things happen. There's all these weird things that can happen. So, all kinds of stuff can shift. But in terms of the through line is Trump still. And Trump's even more convinced of his genius now. He survived an assassination attempt. He came back in a way that nobody said he ever could. I mean, he's the first president in, 100 plus years to get re-elected after being away from office. Why should anybody know any better than him? And so all of the people are trying to figure out how they influence Trump. And Putin's got a much better chance of influencing Trump because Trump thinks of him as a peer. So, Kirill Dmitriev has got all kinds of ways of influencing Trump because he used to work for Goldman Sachs and he knows how to deal with high net worth individuals, client management, because that's where your money comes from, right? And I mean, the most effective person I thought in the previous Trump version was Mnuchin, who used to work Goldman Sachs, because he just kind of had his Goldman Sachs, kind of approach. So this is a person who has high net worth in terms of power and, influence, and I need to manage him because my job, basically depends on that. And Putin's, kind of position to keep the war going but keep Trump engaged all depends on how he manages him. So it's no surprise whatsoever they picked Kirill Dmitriev instead of Ushakov and Lavrov, who by this time, kind of a bit boring and, wouldn't talk to him in the same way. And that's why Witkoff is out there, for Trump, kind of acting in the person of Trump. But really what Trump wants more than anything is to sit down with Putin and to do it himself. He just wants Witkoff to prepare the way.
Yes, please.
Oh, it's such a treat. So much better than watching you all on YouTube. So my question is to go back to what Europe can do. I also watched, besides all of you wonderful people, Sir Bill Browder, who has been really advocating for the money that Europe has frozen, specifically in the UK, I think, and to take that money and to throw it back in to fight against Russia. In other words, to fund everything. Is there any possibility of that happening?
From what I hear, the possibility of that happening is actually very slim.
Really? And why would that be?
Most of the money is in Europe, and European governments are still quite adamant that money, that would create a legal precedent, and it would also deter future investors and people from, sovereign states from holding their money in their banks. So there's very strong European opposition.
Kind of like the Swiss in World War II. A little bit like that.
To be honest with you, I would also be against that because it creates a very bad precedent. Because, take private property and without procedure, just like we see now in the United States, you can be kicked out just, without any procedure, right? So to take somebody's property, and that's exactly what Putin, by the way, does. He privatized, he nationalized Danone, he some, other companies. I think that it is very, very dangerous way. After all, it's more important. It's a question of values that Europe and United States can project to the outer world. And private property is a very important value. And so, and procedure and rule of law, that's a very important values. So when you tell people like, Russians, I constantly listen to Russians just because, I run a website, the New Times, and, they, even smart people whom I knew very well and know very well, they keep saying that they're so disgusted now with the Western model that, they never expected that the West could do it, just grab property and go. It is, I think it's from, perspective, we're not going to die all tomorrow. I hope we're going to live. And for this, we need people to believe in the values, in the rule of law, in procedure, and in the value of the private property.
Do you think it's unusual that he's doing that?
Who?
Of his stature, though, broader, because he's so influential, he's a smart guy, he was there for 20 years.
Bill has Bill has a lot of personal reasons. He was kicked out of Russia. He was very successful businessman. He was very much involved in green mail, if you know what is green mail. Using media on the ground that, write some dirt about, companies' shares go down. And at that point, his fund was buying, shares of the valuable companies. So he was a great supporter of Putin, by the way. I remember we met in 2007 with him, and he published in Moscow Times, where I also was a columnist with the Moscow Times, and he published a column saying that, when Putin imprisoned Khodorkovsky, he's finally, Russia got a leader who is going to clean the space and blah, blah, blah. And he was all proud. I felt like, all proud got out of the ground, his grandfather, who was the leader of the Communist Party of the United States. So, and then he got kicked out. That's what happens. Like, now, they arrested Mashkovich, the guy who is worth $2.6 billion. He believed Putin. He repatriated his money from Cyprus. And, a year ago, would you believe it? You would think that people are smart, but they're idiots, of course. And they're arrested now. And they're going to take everything, just the way they did it with Michael Calvi, who also was a great supporter of Putin, Anyway, I'm sorry. Yes, please. Yes. Yeah. But, we need Hannah. Okay. I'm so sorry.
Oh.
Yeah.
We all know that Putin has a very keen sense of symbolic politics, and a month from tomorrow is May 9th, the 80th anniversary of the victory. Do you think that Trump will go to Moscow for it, first of all? And do you think that Putin has any special goals that he insists need to be achieved by May 9th and celebrated on that day?
Well, I think to answer that question, I'm thinking of the final chapters of my book, which go back to the year 2020, when right before the pandemic, Putin went to Israel to mark the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and he gave a speech in which again he dropped hints that it would be great if the leaders of the victor powers of World War II, if they could get together and sit together. So obviously he meant Donald Trump, who was president at the time, and probably the Chinese and maybe some Europeans, to get around and sort of have a reunion and figure out the fate of the world. Of course, then the pandemic hit, and any thought of Donald Trump appearing at the May 9th parade was off the table. So, with that in mind, and sort of Putin's idea that he would, this idea of Yalta II was always out there, that he would really like to get together with the other masters of the planet and sort of, decide the fate of the world. I do think that's certainly going to be a temptation, and we know that after the first Trump, at least the first public Trump Putin phone call, Trump said that, they discussed visits to each other's countries. So I can imagine that there will be a push for May 9th. And of course, it's not unprecedented. American presidents have attended the May 9th parade. So, and even U.S. troops have participated in the May 9th parade. So I can imagine that there will be a big push. And it creates, of course, it's a great question. I think it presents some kind of deadline, right? We'd been hearing for a long time that there was an Easter deadline. So April 20th, because in this year, the Orthodox and the Western calendars align, and so that you would have a ceasefire by April 20th. Of course, that seems quite far-fetched, but maybe they'll find another reason to meet. Maybe they have to meet and talk about how to solve the Ukraine problem.
Well, I think he's more likely to do that than to come to Concord for the 250th anniversary, because every 50 years, the American president has come to Concord, Massachusetts. Yeah, Concord, Massachusetts. He's more likely, I think, to go to Moscow than to Concord, but I'm only a historian, so I don't have to predict things.
I would just say, though, Nina, that if, kind of this is being posited and Putin extends an invitation, obviously this would be a massive provocation. Because, this is, VE, day for in Europe as well, and there's a lot of debate about this. You've got the NATO summit coming up, in June. And it would really then, this would be a test, getting back to sort of foreign policy, as to, what Congress thinks, the Senate, what the American public think. There's a lot of support still for Ukraine out there. I don't think this would be an easy, Trump could go ahead and do it, but I don't know, it depends on, whether he thinks he can get away with it. Because, as you said, he's been invited, but this would be for Putin, this would be a real test to see how far he's got. And it's going to be a test for all of us to see, how that is debated, if it's debated, where the pushback, would come from. We know that J.D. Vance, went to Munich, because I was there, heard him at the Munich Security Conference, as others did. He went to lay, kind of wreath at Auschwitz, said never again, and then was supporting the AfD, by the time of his speech. So I wouldn't say that there's consistency and not, kind of no shortage of hypocrisy, kind of in the current administration. But, they might actually do that argument. Well, we were invited before, couldn't go because COVID, whatever, or other US presidents have been. But yes, but not in the time when, there is a massive, the second, after World War II, the largest military conflict in Europe, and it's by Russia being the aggressor rather than, the kind of the country that was purportedly on the defensive during World War II.
Yeah, it will be an awful message.
Yes, very interesting, the discussion. Thank you very much. I wanted to loop back to the Black Sea Basin. It's come up several times. And to try to put a more constructive spin on things, clearly many countries involved in the Black Sea Basin. Is there, in your view, any theme, any issue, an opportunity for cooperation around the Black Sea? Or will it forever be overshadowed with what's happening in Ukraine and with the war?
I personally think, yes, there's lots of prospects for Black Sea cooperation. Lots of discussions were going on before the war, but the war makes that very complicated, unfortunately. Because you've now seen also the renaming of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. There's a big push, for Russia to, kind of also, you saw in the Duma, an effort to call the Black Sea the Russian Sea. The Sea of Azov, which is part of the Black Sea, has obviously been pretty much laid claim to by Russia. But of course, that when you talked about the Mariupol and, the other Sea of Azov ports, and, the future of Odessa, there's Georgia, also another kind of country on the Black Sea. There has been a push for cooperation around the Black Sea. And again, I do think that, to be frank, of course there's prospects, but the war, makes that incredibly difficult. There was a hope by the Turks and others that by having the Black Sea grain deal, that this would actually become, kind of a basis for, basically putting the Black Sea off limits for the war, but of course that hasn't transpired at all. But I think when we do think about a real, proper peace deal, the Black Sea is going to have to be part of that in the future. And what happens to the Sea of Azov? The Sea of Azov is part of the Black Sea, but it's been denied freedom of navigation, actually going back to 2018 when Russia seized a Ukrainian ship and the sailors. That was the first kind of crisis, kind of going back there.
Well, and now it's been turned into a de facto Russian lake.
Exactly.
Right?
So that kind of complicated, but at some point, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So, Fiona, I have a question for you, but Yevgenia, Lucian, please weigh in if you have a different view. The question touches on European security broadly. You were talking about it earlier. You were NIO in 2008 when the Russians first began to table ideas for new European security decision-making architecture.
So we put it closer. No, just closer.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
That's good. You have to speak right in the mic.
I have a question about proposals that the Russians started to table in 2008 and for years thereafter, which no one on our side was particularly interested in having a conversation about. I'm curious now, since you touched on it, in your view, looking at European receptivity, how ripe, in your view, is the idea of a conversation about new architecture for European security broadly? And if you do sense more ripeness today than then, to what extent might this be an inducement for Putin to try and move him forward toward what we want, to simply agree to have discussions about new stuff?
Yeah, I like the way that you use the word inducement because, obviously we were talking about incentives before, and inducement involves a bit of a push rather than just an attraction. There is a whole debate about a new European security among the Europeans, but it's also because it's been, kind of looked at as a reaction to what Putin has done in Ukraine, but now, frankly, a reaction to what the United States has done. And one of the reasons that it didn't take off in 2007, 2008, when Medvedev, which I think you're probably alluding to, went to Berlin. And because remember, Medvedev was president for a while. We've kind of forgotten all of that. And then it was one of his kind of maiden speeches in front of the Bundestag. And he was talking about a new concert of Europe. And then Lavrov went around Europe talking about a new concert of Europe, 18th century style, Metternich and, the great powers, getting together. There was still a kind of feeling that one of those great powers was the United States. And it was kind of not just a pitch to Europe, but it was also the idea that this would be about the United States, and the big powers in Europe would include the United States and then Germany, obviously, and maybe some of the others if, they kind of looked like they were meaningful at the time. It certainly didn't involve Belgium or, kind of the Baltic states or Finland or Sweden at that, particular juncture. Well, now the debate is among all of those other states. The Finland's, kind of a part of NATO along with Sweden, who are actually leading in many respects some of this new discussions. It's the Baltic states who have been punching way above their weight diplomatically, ever since the war came out. So this is very much a different debate. It is a bit exactly that about the new European security, but it's also without the United States. And the question is, where would Russia come into it as something other than adversary? And that's, kind of a very interesting point. If Putin's still kind of waiting out for Ukraine to be handed to him or for Europe to fall apart, there's not much of an incentive, for him to do anything, to have a discussion. But there might be an inducement if something looks real in Europe. Because we get back, Turkey, obviously has come in the context of thinking about the Black Sea. And the Turks have been a bit worried that they might be left out of a kind of a new European security discussion, despite the fact that Turkey was off, kind of playing around in the Middle East and, kind of various points. The idea that there might be a new European security discussion without Turkey has brought kind of the Turks back in, wondering why they're not being invited, to, all of the various meetings. They have been, but Erdogan's been a bit preoccupied at the moment. But there's, for Turkey, there's been an inducement to come back and talk to the Europeans because there's a feeling that something might happen without them. So I think that you're actually right and onto something. If Europe shows that it's really serious and gets its act together, this could be something a little bit more in the positive vein, that Putin might suddenly feel And it'd be interesting to see, Zhenya, when you're picking up on what Russians are thinking about Europe at this moment, that they might feel that they might need to have a completely different discussion. Because up until now, Putin's thought, well, you just talk about Europe, with the US. It's the idea of, Margaret Thatcher and her entourage, and somebody asked about the meat and the vegetables, and she said the vegetables will, basically the idea that, everybody around her is just a vassal or a vegetable. That's kind of been the Putin view of Europe, is just like, who cares about Europe? We're not going to talk to Europe because Europe is meaningless. But if the US is out of the picture and Europe's doing something, maybe this is, a very different place. And we've recently heard a lot of anti-European sentiment coming out of Moscow. Is that a reaction to that? Is that because they think something's happening? I'd be interested to see what you think.
Putin always wanted to destroy the European Union because, from his perspective, it was much easier to deal with each country one by one, rather than the European Union. It's the size of the American economy. It's the biggest trade partner to China, so bigger than the United States. So he always was very interested in destroying the European Union. That's what he was doing all the time. When you say Russians, listen, 2 million Russians left after the war started.
And then most of them are living in Europe.
And most of them live in Europe. Approximately 500,000, we don't know how many, returned back because they didn't find jobs, but it's very difficult for them to live in Europe because, you cannot get visa. I cannot get visa to Europe. They don't have, bank accounts. It's very, very difficult. And, I don't complain. We're responsible for what we did because, we allowed a leader who started this awful war and killing, people in Ukraine. So, I bear responsibility for that full, 100%. And so I think that Europeans are right to be afraid. When I see Russians in Lithuania, when I was still in Moscow and I was running, after the war already started to Lithuania, I saw Russians and I thought, wait a second, it took slightly over 100 special forces troops to topple, to kill the president of Afghanistan and to change the whole regime in Afghanistan. What it takes, just to change regime in Lithuania or in Latvia or in Estonia. Estonia, 1 million people. Lithuanians, 2.3 million people, So it's so easy just to topple the government, bring another puppet there. And so they should be concerned because there are a hell of a lot of group people, KGB people, and etc. Europe should be concerned about it. We see about all, this sabotage, terrorist attacks all across Europe. And there will be escalation of that for sure.
Basically to sharpen that point, see, kind of Lucian there, the thing is, if Europe actually starts to counteract that, which they are starting to do, because it's not just concern, there's actually a lot of anger about Russia. There is a desire among a coalition, for sure, of Europeans to build something real. And then does that change the calculation, I think, is what you're asking there. And it might, at some point. It's just, right now, perhaps not. Basically, if in Russia, Putin is still not taking Europe seriously. But I saw the last couple of weeks a bit of an inkling that there's a bit of a harsher tone towards Europe, rather than just looking at Europe as a bunch of vassals of the United States, realizing that Europe might have agency. And that, kind of might shift things a bit. I don't know, Lucian, if you...
But, Russian media kept, they were running this propaganda machine, which, United States, you're not evil. It was the symbol of evil, United States. And all of a sudden, they fell in love with Trump. There is just this bromance going on, and especially Russian reach. They were so excited that now the moods go down. So they do realize that probably it's not going to happen. Yes, please. We have somebody there. Yes, please.
Oh, thank you. This is a follow-up on the Black Sea question. So there's a long article in today's Times about how Ukraine would have, or appears to have, no interest in a ceasefire on the Black Sea front because, A, they were already successful with their drone and other attacks on the Russian Black Sea fleet. They moved their ships north, grain export and traffic has increased almost to pre-war levels, and that Putin, on the other hand, does have an interest in a ceasefire there, maybe because they could inspect the ships or delay the shipments or whatever. So I was just curious as to what your take on the ceasefire potential there is that supposedly is being negotiated, but the interests seem very far apart.
I think that assessment is correct. I mean, the Ukrainians are actually in the Black Sea in a pretty good place, and if the Russians get what they want, I mean, they would actually have access to parts of the Black Sea that they might not have now. Plus, they're demanding that one of their state banks gets access again to international markets through the SWIFT system, which of course is not a decision that the US can take, but the Europeans. So, yeah, it's sort of, it's sort of Putin asking for something that they would really like, and without the Ukrainians really getting any huge benefit out of it.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we have here. Yes, please.
Yeah, so I look at these issues.
Would you put it closer to?
I look at these issues as a policy advisor, and also as a business person. The 2020 financial crisis is important because the U.S. Put money into this country in order to help get it out of that financial crisis. But in Germany, during that same period of time, they did use the same approach. I know because they used my solution. So, but they did not put money into the economy like the U.S. did. And the reason I point that out is if Germany actually does raise $1 trillion, as it said it would do, I think that says that they're really serious because they're breaking a taboo of putting money into the economy. So it's my thought for.
Thank you. Yes, please. Uh-huh.
Yes, thank you again for a great freewheeling discussion that gives us a lot to think about. My question is about the incentives or disincentives for Putin to come to some kind of agreement, ceasefire, whatever. It was mentioned that the estimates in the West of up to 800,000 casualties, including possibly 200,000 dead. 200,000. We lost 55,000 in 10 years in Vietnam. So my question is...
15,000.
55.
No, 15,000. 15,081, to be precise.
So my question is, what do we not understand about the Russian mindset, their political philosophy, their history, their religion, that would allow Putin to assume that he could grind on for another 3 years and lose twice as many and still come out ahead? It doesn't make any sense to hear that here in the West.
I would actually, say, you're touching upon one of these kind of fundamental points here, because Trump clearly doesn't understand that. You're absolutely right. I think genuinely Trump does want to end this because he thinks it's a senseless slaughter. And he, like everybody else, has been, somewhat shaped by, he's not a great historian, but, the stories of the Great War, World War II, there's certainly that kind of image. Vietnam probably thinks it's actually a much higher rate of casualties. But the American Civil War, 600,000 people were actually killed. And if you had ever just picked up on any of those figures, you'd think this is, crazy, senseless slaughter. So I do think there's a genuine desire for him to stop that. But that's not Putin. And that's why I said it's about a cost or a price for Putin. And Putin has already figured out, and, we've all observed this, and many people here as well, that, Russians will not organize against that kind of, casualty rate. There's a whole host of reasons for that. They're not all cultural, but they're all deeply, in Russian Soviet history. Remember, Stalin said one person being killed is a tragedy, that becomes statistics. It's just kind of people can't envisage all of this. And also not everybody's not seeing all of these people dying at once. Right early on in the war, there was a backlash. because there was massive casualty rates in Pskov and also in Kostroma and, by various divisions who first moved into Ukraine. You wrote about, all of this. And there was a backlash to some degree there. You've had protests in Buryatia and other places where there's been a kind of a concentration of soldiers that have died at the front. But mostly it's been spread around the country. And also people have got incentives, to kind of sign up for money. I mean, you can, talk more about this as well, Lucian. So Putin has calculated you can do all kinds of stealth mobilization. There are payments, there's economic incentives for people to sign up. And it's not an existential issue for Russia yet because he thinks that it will be over with, before this. He's not going to fight to the last Russian. Plus, there are all sort of others who, we're now finding Chinese and hapless, no doubt Chinese and others who are there. So for Putin, this is a cold calculation that based on a whole host of factors that he can withstand this in ways that absolutely would not be possible in other settings.
Yeah, I would only add to that, for example, when you look at the Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan, you can also compare statistics there, and it seems like Ukraine has been much more costly even than 10 years of war in Afghanistan. I think one reason why there was at least in the popular mind there was people were upset about it because it was a draft. I mean it affected everybody in the Soviet Union, and I think the difference. One thing that's very hard, because I think you're expressing something that's also sort of from the Western mindset, how can the Russians take these incredible losses without, becoming outraged or going out in the street? And I think one thing to keep in mind is that Russian society is extremely atomized, that people are really very, there's no sense of being necessarily part of something bigger. They're very concerned about their own survival or the survival of their own loved ones. And then, picking up on what Fiona said, the way that this war has been prosecuted, I mean, once the ranks of the professional Russian army were decimated, it was also very targeted mobilization going after vulnerable groups and marginalized groups, where actually the opportunity to serve in the Russian army was a great financial boon to entire regions and certainly to families. And so it sort of defies, from an American point of view, sort of, how could this actually happen? But I think in a Russian context, the way that he did it, I mean, certainly Putin personally doesn't care about these human losses, but I think it's also been the way that he's sort of been able to compartmentalize the losses, and that when you go to a place like Moscow, you don't necessarily feel like there's a war going on in the country, and there are a lot of regions that are voiceless or practically voiceless in Russia, where then you would find a lot more.
No, it's not exactly right, Lucian. In Moscow, GPS is no longer working, and it's been going like that for several months. So Moscow is a huge city of about 13 million people. With the big Moscow, it's over 18 million people. And GPS is not working. There are no GPS maps anymore because, they're so concerned about drones. So they shut down GPS, and GPS is American. They tried to build their own, and of course they stole all the money, and there is no anything else. So that's point one. Point two, there is very little possibility to travel for the big cities, for people who got accustomed to live in the world, not like we in the Soviet Union. We lived in the cell. My father and mother never were abroad, just never ever in their life. They just read about the life outside the Soviet Union. So now, about the resistance. You have to understand that those who were capable to resist, unfortunately, ran away. All of us, and all my friends are either abroad or they're in jails. And these are all leaders of the Russian opposition. My biggest friend, Alexei Navalny, killed. Yashin was in the labor camp, was swamped. Misha Krieger sitting in the camp. Volodya Komroza was arrested, got 25 years, was, released as a result of Gorinov, I can tell you, all leaders of the Russian opposition, they're either already killed or they're sitting in jails. And those who are abroad, what can you do abroad, It's not, 1917. I don't expect Lenin and Trotsky, to go to Moscow. So there was resistance at the beginning. And people were trying, they were, when the war started, there were all kind of letters, people from different associations of judges, scientists, journalists, blah, blah, you name it. All of them were writing letters around the war, against the war. And what Putin did? Great. Some were put in jail, others lost their jobs, especially professors, all professors of the universities who were against the war, all were kicked out. Each and every one. In Высшей школе экономики, in high school of economics, where I taught. Nobody left. I just don't understand who is teaching there. Because everyone fired. Whether we're talking about mathematicians, economists, they liquidated totally, political science department where I taught, liquidated totally sociology departments. Of course, why do you need this? So, and finally, Russia is a very big country. It is, as you're well aware, it's the biggest country on the face of the earth. So what Putin did, he doesn't recruit people from Moscow and St. Peter.
Yeah.
Where, revolutions happen in the capitals. Yeah. So he recruits people in the most impoverished regions of the Russian Federation. Tuva, Buryatia, these are very, and when you look at the names of those who were killed, you don't see Russian names, you don't see Ukrainian names, that's all names with O, that's usually Ukrainians. So you see all names, Tuva, Buryatia, Kalmykia, Dagestan, as you can identify Irish, I can identify, this. So, and that was very smart because they don't have access to information. Putin did exactly what Soviets did. He divided information space. Yeah. There is no longer common information space. People in Dagestan don't know what's going on, in Kursk. People in Kursk don't know what's happening, where the people anywhere in Russia concerned that their houses were destroyed, when Ukrainians occupied part of Kursk region. So it is much more complicated than just, yes, and that all Russians are slaves or anything like that. No, it's not that easy. And trust me, people from my circles, my friends, all of us who want to get back home. I I never thought that I was going to be such nostalgic as I am. But and it's the end of life. I once wrote a piece that we are living dead because we have no future. We lost our own country, our homes. So, and once again, I agree, it is our fault. We lost to Putin. We did. Because we enjoyed this, this bourgeois life, because, we got the possibility to travel, to get education, It's hard, when you have something to lose. Navalny was an exceptional man, and that's why Putin killed him. Anyway, thank you so much. We have to end up here. It's 7:10 already, so thank you so much. And thank you very much to this great panel, Fiona Hill, Lucian Kim. Thank you very much to all of you for coming and for your great questions. Thank you.